Hi, I'm Bobby, and in today's video I'm going to be talking to you about my top 5 books that I read in 2020. So this list is going to be in no particular order. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each book, what I liked about it, what I think you might enjoy about it, and why I chose to read it in the first place. So the first book on this list is one that I've already decided to reread this year, and that is The Night Circus by Erin Morgenstern. This is a modern classic. It is fantasy, it is magical and mysterious, and full of so many different weird and wonderful characters who are like so complex and detailed, and they just feel like really three-dimensional. I initially chose to read this book because some people at my university were talking about it in class. It was one I'd heard my lecturer talk about with another student, and it sort of piqued my interest, but I was a little intimidated by the sound of it. But I bought it a few years ago and then only just got around to reading it in 2020. I read this book back in March, and it took me about a week to read this book, which is about 500 pages. 600 pages. It's about 600 pages, this book, and it took me roughly a week to read. I just think the writing in this story was beautiful and magical. I started rereading it the other day, and although I haven't got very far yet, I am completely immersed in the story already. I am looking forward to meeting each of these characters again, and I really think this is a book for someone who likes character-driven stories. There is quite a big plot to this, but the characters are what makes it such a special story. And if you're into magic, mystery, and just lots of beautiful writing, then I really think you should give this book a go. It does look intimidating in its size, in its appearance, the fact that it's a classic, but honestly, you feel like it is really worth the read. You feel that once you finish this book, you've actually read something worthwhile, and I highly, highly recommend this one to anyone who likes fantasy or character-driven narratives, magic, circus themes, although the circus part isn't that big a deal. It's not like a proper circus, it's more like a carnival. But still. And it's a lot of behind the scenes of the circus within the story. The second book on my list is a graphic novel, and that is Postal. I have volume 2 here, but I read volume 1 last year, and I have lent it out to someone, so I haven't got that one with me. However, Postal was a very strange story. It has a bit of a weird concept to it to begin with. It is set in a town where all the inhabitants are former criminals, and they've kind of decided that they're not going to do crime anymore. And I think they're all fugitives, really, so they're just hiding from the law, but they've sort of reinvented themselves and gone to a life without crime. So in this town, everyone's a former criminal, and crime is completely banned in their town. If anyone commits a crime, they are kicked out. Well, they might have been murdered, I can't remember. I think they get shot if they commit a crime, but whatevs. And then, at the beginning of the first one, they discover someone has been murdered. And this story follows I think it's a teenager, Mark. So the main character of this story is an autistic boy. So the main character of this story is on the autistic spectrum, and he is investigating this murder which happened in their town. I found it really interesting to follow a character with a different type of thought process to myself. It's really interesting seeing inside his mind and like seeing the way he talks to people. Personally, I think it's represented well, but as someone who isn't autistic, I can't be certain of this. So if anyone on the autistic spectrum has read this and disagrees with that, then let me know. I'd be really interested to see what an own voice's perspective would be. However, I think it's nice to have representation, and if it is good representation, then it's really nice to see. But yeah, I think the artwork in this is really good. It's quite realistic. I don't know what I want to show you because it's the sequel, but So this is the first page of the sequel. I don't think there's spoilers there, but it is quite nice artwork. It's not cartoony is what I mean. It's sort of realistic. And I enjoyed the atmosphere of the whole thing, the characters, the whole setting and everything. I found it really enjoyable, and as someone who was only just getting into graphic novels at the beginning of last year, this one was a really good one with which to start. So I recommend it to anyone who likes mysteries, detective stories, or if you're just getting into graphic novels. It's quite an easy place to start. It's not too complex or anything, and it is quite easy to follow. I read this book back in April and I completed it in one day. The next book on my list, I believe, was the first thriller I've read, and that is There's Someone Inside Your House by Stephanie Perkins. This is a YA contemporary thriller set in a high school within a small town in Nebraska. It is set in the lead up to Halloween. It has a lot of autumnal vibes and it is kind of spooky, but it's not like properly scary. I found it quite tame. As someone who's not really into thrillers or horrors, or at least I'm not used to them yet, I was a bit anxious about reading a scary story, but it was quite tame in scare factor, so if that's something you worry about, then this one might be a nice one for you. However, I will say that it is quite gory. There are teenagers getting murdered throughout this story, and there are some quite grotesque ways in which they are murdered. I don't really want to say details if you're not into gore, but things get cut off. So I enjoyed this book partly because it was quite tame in scare factor, but also I didn't think it was necessarily too predictable. Like, it was quite fun guessing the mystery, but I didn't think it was like glaringly obvious throughout the whole thing. So that was quite nice to see, and I think there's only like one point near the end where you sort of realise who it is, and even then it's like you have to think through it to work out how that person could have been involved. It's really difficult to talk about thrillers without giving away spoilers. So this follows a teenage girl who is from Hawaii, but her parents are sort of going through something, so they've sent her to Nebraska to live with her grandmother, who I think the grandmother's living on her own for the first time after losing her husband, and our protagonist, Makani, is taking care of her elderly grandmother. I think this book is really good for someone who wants to start getting into horror and thriller stories but isn't too sure about them. This is aimed at teenagers and young adults, so it isn't like the scariest, most gory detail, although there is a lot of violence and quite a bit of bloodshed in this story. So if you're someone like me who is just starting to get into this genre, I think this is quite a gentle, easy way of getting into it without feeling too anxious. It didn't make me feel anxious. I was like completely absorbed into the story. Like, I only read it when I got home from work in the evenings, and as soon as I got home I would just grab the book and just read a couple of chapters, and it was so fun. I was just so keen to read the next chunk, and I think that you could really enjoy this story. I read this book back in June in the middle of a reading slump, and although I was struggling with reading, it did take me a month to read, but that's not because of the book, that's more sort of my brain thing. But it is quite an easy read, and it is a really short book, only about 300 pages. Less than 300 pages. The fourth book on my list is another graphic novel, and that is Sheets by Brenna Thumler. This is a really cute story. It is one long story, but it is a complete story. This follows a teenage girl who has recently lost her mother and is sort of grieving. Her dad's going through like severe grief depression, and he's sort of hidden away. So our main character, Marjorie, has to basically run the family laundrette. It also follows the perspective of a young ghost called Wendell, who, as you can see in the image, is represented by a sheet. And Wendell travels to the world of the living, goes into the laundrette and tries to make friends with the sheets. It is so cute. It is the most adorable story I've ever read. It's got some beautiful, beautiful artwork in here. It's such a cute story with beautiful artwork. It is emotional, it is kind of tragic. There is a lot of grief in the story for obvious reasons. There is child death, there is a man who's trying to take over the laundrette. He's kind of evil, and I hate him. But overall, this is a beautiful story, and it's a loving story about friendship and family, and just taking care of those people who matter to you. So I think if you're looking for an easy graphic novel to get into, if you're looking for a story about hope and family and friendship, if you want something really gentle and really beautiful, I think you should give this one a go. The last book on my list is one that came out years ago and I think is really underrated, and that is The Shock of the Fall by Nathan Filer. I bought this book back in 2014 maybe, and I think I bought it because of Reagan at Peruse Project, which wouldn't surprise anyone. But this story is also about grief, and a story following a young boy who loses his disabled older brother to a tragic accident, and he feels that he's to blame and he suffers from a lot of guilt, and that causes him a lot of mental health problems. So I'll give trigger warnings now for grief, death, mental illness, drug use, alcohol abuse. There's a lot of sort of tragic things in here. There's like a mental health institution involved in this story. It's an emotional ride, but it is so beautifully written, and you feel such a strong connection to the character in this story. This book helped me get out of a reading slump earlier this year, so it is a really easy sort of book to get through if the subject matter is something that interests you or that you can cope with reading about. So like I said, this follows a young boy after he loses his disabled older brother, and it watches him as he grows up into sort of teenagehood and young adulthood, and sort of how his family reacts to the situation, how he deals with it mentally and emotionally. And it's a really interesting look at how grief can affect young people, and it is tragic, it's emotional, it's heart-wrenching, but it's so beautifully written, and it's just a really nice sort of piece about a character who is really struggling. It can be a difficult read at times, sort of emotionally, but I really think it is worth reading if the subject matter interests you, because I think you can learn a lot about a character and about sort of the human mind and how it deals with bad situations. And I think it is just sort of I would say gentle contemporary, but like it's quite slow paced, it is easy reading, it is, I won't call it a vacation read either. I think if you are looking for something sort of heart-wrenching and emotional, this book is really, really worth your time. I read this book back in May and it took me less than a week to read, so it is easy to get through. It does fill you with hope in the end, I will tell you that. It's got a hopeful ending. So I think this is a really underrated young adult contemporary. So those are my top 5 books that I read in 2020. I hope you found this list interesting, and if there's any books you think I might like based on these books, I would love to hear about them. If you have heard about these books and you've been putting them off, then I highly recommend that you just go for it. Just give them the chance, and I really think each and every one of these books is really worth your time. So I'd love to hear what books you really enjoyed reading in 2020 and which books you are looking forward to reading in the coming year. And until next time, bye!